Hey everyone. So, going into this chapter, I'd heard some things about the pacing. And when it comes to stuff like that, I always try to go in with an optimistic attitude. Like, okay, even if the pacing isn't good, maybe there will be some redeeming qualities about it. It might not be great, but it can't be outright terrible, right? well, I I ate my words pretty quickly when reading this chapter because honestly, I don't say this often about My Hero Academia, but I feel it needs to be said here. This feels like the worst paced chapter of My Hero Academia across the entire series. As right from the jump, with barely any context or build-up aside from a conversation with All for One, we start off with Izuku confronting Aoyama, and I'll say this much before I go into full-on rant mode. As the chapter goes on, you do slowly start to understand the reasoning as to why this conversation is taking place, but as it eventually all leads up to as you can see as you see the plan that's been built up for so many chapters start to take shape all the way leading up to All for One being lured out into the open. So I think in that context we're supposed to feel like it was rushed because that's how it's intended to feel in real time with situations like this. How it was entirely staged, how the conversation in itself was entirely staged. With that said, I think this is also one of those times where Horikoshi just took that idea a little too literally, because after All for One appears, we immediately jump right head first into a full-on confrontation between heroes and villains, and everything is just going at such a breakneck speed that you can't properly digest any of the information of what's going on. And maybe this is one of those things where the anime might handle it better, but I think part of the reason as to why this doesn't work is that for as much as this final battle and these moments have been built up over several chapters now, it doesn't feel like the final. It doesn't feel like any of this was self-contained. Was what any of this in itself was properly built up or felt self-contained in its pacing within its own chapter. Like if you look at it from taking in all the information, I'm sure the chapter will be a lot better. But if you're looking at this chapter as standalone, the pacing does not work. The pacing doesn't feel self-contained with its own chapter, which in itself is weird because the reveal in itself, the reveal of both the heroes and villains simultaneously preempting each other's arrival is the one part that still works for me because I at this point the heroes and the villains have had this continuous back and forth or they've just been kind of where they've been trying to just get the better of each other up to this point. So it makes sense that the final reveal of both the heroes and villains in this up to this point would be just them kind of preempting the other's arrival kind of thing. With that, so yeah, as a whole, just the pacing is all over the place with this one. With all that being said out of the way, though, one thing I really like about this chapter is Aoyama's speech, because even though on the surface a lot of what he's saying to Izuku is correct about how, despite how many times throughout history that society has rebuilt itself, the one thing that never seems to change are the rules, laws, just the whole just the whole outlook on society in itself. And that is kind of a hard truth, but I do like how Horikoshi presented it with this chapter largely being kind of with us knowing that everything that's being said is sort of a ruse to lure out All for One. It is one of those funny things where even though he's addressing Izuku, it does feel like he's like Aoyama himself is kind of talking to All for One indirectly and in a very subtle, indirect way of saying, yeah, society's fucked up and there's a lot that could and needs to be fixed that could be fixed with him ruling that needs to be fixed, but him ruling over society isn't going to actually fix any of that shit. If anything, it's going to make things worse. If anything, just the idea of All for One becoming the sole ruler of the world is only going to make things worse because even if the man has the power and the ability in order to change all those things that Aoyama had mentioned, like potable water, all that stuff, it doesn't change the fact that All For One himself has proven to be the kind of villain where it's like, if you want those kind of things, you're gonna have to subjugate yourself before him. Like that again, it's all sounds good on paper, but he's just you can and all he says is true, but it's in this sort of twisted way of like he's the only if you that knowing that he's the one you can probably trust. Yeah, it doesn't inspire much confidence. Um, and I do like how someone legitimately called out All For One on all of that bullshit. And but it being Aoyama specifically, it makes this moment for him even more powerful, because even though it took a while, this moment of Aoyama standing up to All For One, this was his starting line moment, the point where, although he's had heroic moments, this is the point where he became like a true hero by standing up, opposing the man who had the most control over his life, and saying, "Your dream world is a nightmare, my man." Like I really appreciate that about this chapter. Now, I do want to talk about the final moments of the chapter where the heroes and villains gather, because, as I said, that's the one part that works for me, as Horikoshi has already, again, done so many hero-villain confrontations at this point that it does make sense to just throw them at each other for the climax. And I especially like how they did use the warp gate to transport the heroes. However, just that little detail in itself does raise a couple questions for me. Like, firstly, what exactly is Kurogiri Obaro's status? Because this is the one thing Horikoshi has been beating around the bush about, and not given like a clear answer as to whether or not Obaro has been brought back to himself. He's still Kurogiri and are only controlling him. Like, I kind of need I still need a definitive answer on what's going to happen to Obaro by the end of this. Like that's one of the minute details that Horikoshi hasn't really done a good job at addressing. Also, kind of going back to the problems I have with the pacing, I'm hoping that now that Horikoshi has set the stage for the final battle, that he'll slow down now, like break up the fights and devote time for each one, because it's clear to me that Horikoshi really wants to meet that 2022 deadline, but he really needs to slow down a little bit now that we are at this point. And like, I'm really worried about how the pacing for a lot of my most anticipated fights are going to shake out. Just please, like, I normally don't make pleas like this, but please, Horikoshi, slow down a little beyond this point. You can afford to do that, and just make sure the conclusions for these characters are satisfactory to you. Just don't bring their stories to a close in a way where you feel it'll help you meet your 2022 deadline. Because I'm sorry, but that's kind of what it's feeling like. Like he's trying to just meet his, and I'm just worried of how these fights are going to shake out. But I'm hoping now that we are at this phase, he slows down a little bit now. But yeah, guys, that's all I got for this review. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and Analyst Control. Be sure to hit the notification bell, hit the subscribe button, and just share the video around, guys. Dark Knight of NA, signing off. Later, everyone.